Welcome to my video on the female feedback loop. In this video, you are going to be learning the hormones of the female hormone reproductive feedback loop and how they interact. By the end of this lesson, the goals are I can describe the role of GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, in helping the release of other hormones. I can describe the role of FSH in estrogen release and explain the role of estrogen in developing secondary sex characteristics. I can describe the role of LH in ovulation and the release of progesterone. And I can describe the role of progesterone in helping maintain the uterine lining. So before we even get into the feedback loop, we need to define some things about hormones. So we know hormones are chemical messengers that move around our body through the bloodstream. We've learned lots of varieties of different hormones already. We're going to look specifically now again at FSH, which you saw in the male reproductive feedback loop. In FSH for females, though, this is for follicle stimulation. So this is for follicle growth in the ovaries. It affects follicular development and estrogen production. And estrogen, which is a new hormone that most of us know, but we're going to now look at more in depth, is going to target various cells. It affects the development of both primary and secondary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics are things like thinking about puberty, the widening of the hips, the narrowing of the shoulders, the breast development, hair development. All of those things are secondary sex characteristics. It is also part of the control of the negative feedback loop. Once estrogen is secreted at high enough amounts, it's going to decrease FSH. And this is one of those times and one of the few times you're going to see a positive feedback loop. The positive feedback is to increase LH and then also help with development and growth of the endometrium. Another hormone we've seen before is called the luteinizing hormone. We saw this in the male feedback loop. This one is going to be for the corpus luteum specifically for females. LH's job in the female feedback loop is to initiate ovulation and then help secrete progesterone and estrogen production. Now, both LH and FSH are tropic hormones, those hormones we learned about before that causes the release of another hormone. Progesterone is specifically targeting the endometrium, that lining of the uterus that gets thicker. And what happens is the progesterone's job is to maintain the endometrium lining. So that means we're inhibiting contractions. Remembering inhibiting means stop. So we don't want any sort of contractions happening. Otherwise, you will release the endometrium lining from the uterine wall and it'll be sloughed off. And that is what is called the menstrual cycle, which we'll get into later. Once progesterone has reached its peak amount and it's no longer needed, it'll cause the negative feedback loop to stop both FSH and LH. So once we have defined these four hormones, we are now going to go and we're going to go build and write down the feedback loop. So we're going to start at the very top with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, as we know, is found inside the brain, and we know the hypothalamus usually talks to the pituitary. In this case, it's the anterior pituitary. Now, how does the hypothalamus talk to the anterior pituitary? It's through a releasing factor or a releasing hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone. Now, gonad means ovaries or testes, the gonads where they house the sperm and the egg. In this case, we're going to be talking about the ovaries, so that's what we're going to try and target. First, we're going to see the release of FSH. Now, you'll notice on my diagram, there are colors. I would highly recommend using these colors or a color as you go through, as you will see in future videos how these colors will help you put some ideas together and create some connections. Right now, we're just building the foundation, which is the negative feedback loop. So we're going to start with FSH, the follicle stimulating hormone, and its job is to build the follicle inside the ovary. So when I say follicle, what I mean by that is we're eventually going to make an egg or an oocyte ova, just an egg to be released during ovulation. So FSH's job is to start building that egg. Once that ovary is starting to mature, and we call that through the follicle, and it's a mature follicle, we're going to see the release of estrogen. So we're going to increase estrogen, and the increase of estrogen causes us to start the thickening of the endometrium lining. So early on in the feedback loop, we're going to start the thickening of the lining that's inside the uterus. And we are going to see if during puberty the development of secondary sex characteristics. Again, we learned about what those are. They're, again, widening of the hips, narrowing of the shoulders, breast development, hair development in females, a little bit different in males. Now, we talked about this in the hormone piece, how this is going to cause a negative feedback to FSH. So once estrogen has reached a high enough amount, it's going to tell FSH to stop secreting. That's a negative feedback loop. But the other role of estrogen is to get LH to start. So we call that a positive feedback loop. We're starting something and keeping it off balance. So here's our LH on the other side, and you will now notice colors have changed. Again, you might want to do that. So LH, or the luteinizing hormone, is going to target the ovary as well. So both of these are coming from the anterior pituitary. One part of it is coming, FSH is coming earlier on in the cycle, and LH is coming later on. Now the reason LH is targeting the ovary is because we want to have ovulation, or the ova released from the follicle. Once you've released the ova from the follicle, we are going to then take that space where the ova was released, and it's going to shrink down into a corpus luteum. Now again, you will notice the color changes on this diagram. If you are using colors, I would recommend changing it now. What's going to happen is once that follicle has shrunk down into something called the corpus luteum, you're going to see the increase of progesterone happening. So the corpus luteum's job is to release that progesterone, and it's going to have some really important jobs. First, it's going to maintain the endometrium. So we started thickening it with estrogen, but now with progesterone, we want to keep it. We don't want it to go away. We want it to stay. So we also know that we're going to stop any sort of uterine contractions. In order to keep the endometrium, we need to make sure our uterus doesn't contract. And last but not least, we also want to inhibit ovulation. The reason we want to inhibit ovulation is because you only ovulate one egg per month. You don't ovulate a ton of eggs per month. Well, you can, and that's how you end up with fraternal twins. However, the goal is to only release one egg per month. So progesterone's job is to help with that. If fertilization does not occur, so we have not learned about fertilization yet or how it happens, but if an egg is not fertilized by a sperm, the corpus luteum will degenerate down into something called a corpus albicans. It's become something even smaller. But without the corpus luteum, you no longer have progesterone. So progesterone decreases, which causes that negative feedback loop back to LH. So if you could please make sure that this is in your notes as the negative feedback loop for females. Again, using colors will help, as we will be utilizing this later to add to and understand the